For decades, Americans believed the suburbs were a promise of space, a promise of safety, a promise of a better life just beyond the city. But look closely. Drive through any suburb in America, from California to Connecticut, and something feels unsettlingly familiar. And it wasn't simply about cost. It was design. It was policy. It was ideology. And once you see why American suburbs look the same, you can never unsee what they've done to American cities, families, and the idea of home itself. Cities don't happen by accident. Every street, every neighborhood, every mile of infrastructure is the result of decisions made long before we ever lived there. In this channel, we don't chase headlines or quick opinions. We slow down. We look at history, design, and the systems beneath the surface. Because to understand cities, you first have to understand the choices that shaped them.
The invention of the American suburb. The American suburb did not begin as repetition. It began as rebellion. In the mid-19th century, American cities were loud, dense, and dangerous by modern standards. Industrialization packed workers tightly around factories. Coal smoke darkened the sky. Sewage ran through open channels. Disease spread quickly through overcrowded housing. For the growing American middle class, the city was no longer a symbol of opportunity. It became a symbol of exhaustion. The suburb emerged as an escape. The first suburban idea. One of the earliest and most influential suburban experiments was Llewellyn Park, built in New Jersey in the 1850s. Designed by Alexander Jackson Davis, it was not cheap housing, and it was not meant for the masses. It was curated. Curving roads followed the natural terrain. Houses were set back, surrounded by trees. The goal was not efficiency, but pastoral harmony. This early suburb carried three ideas that would define American suburban thinking for the next 150 years. First, separation from industry. Second, separation from density. Third, separation from people unlike yourself. At the time, these ideas were openly celebrated. The suburb was marketed as moral architecture, a place where families could be protected from the corrupting influences of the city, where children could grow up surrounded by greenery instead of smokestacks. But this model was expensive and limited. It required land, transportation, and time. The suburb could not become America's default living pattern until one critical invention arrived. Transportation changed everything. The streetcar. By the late 1800s, electric streetcars allowed people to live farther from where they worked. Developers quickly realized they could buy cheap land outside city centers, build housing, and sell a lifestyle rather than a structure. These early streetcar suburbs still featured architectural diversity. You could walk to local shops, streets were narrow, homes were built individually or in small batches. Uniformity was not yet the goal. But the seeds were planted. As suburbs expanded outward, something else expanded alongside them: standardization. Standardization enters American housing. At the turn of the 20th century, America was learning how to mass-produce almost everything: cars, appliances, furniture, even food. Housing was next. Companies like Sears began selling mail-order homes, entire houses shipped by rail, assembled on site using standardized parts. This was not yet suburban sameness, but it introduced a dangerous idea for future urban form. Homes could be products. Once housing became a product, it could be optimized. Once optimized, it could be replicated. Once replicated, it could be scaled. The question was no longer how a neighborhood felt. The question became how efficiently it could be built and sold. The suburb becomes policy. The true transformation of the American suburb came in the 1930s and 1940s, not from architects, but from government. The Great Depression devastated housing markets. Construction collapsed. Foreclosure surged. The federal government intervened in ways that would permanently reshape American cities. The Federal Housing Administration introduced standardized underwriting guidelines. On the surface, these rules were about financial stability. In practice, they dictated design. Neighborhoods were evaluated based on uniformity. Mixed-use areas were considered risky. Dense older neighborhoods were downgraded. New suburban developments with consistent housing types, curving roads, and clear separation of land uses were favored. Uniformity was no longer aesthetic. It was financial. If a neighborhood looked predictable, it was considered safe for investment. The hidden power of zoning. At the same time, zoning laws spread across American cities. Zoning separated residential areas from commercial and industrial uses.
Single-family zoning became dominant, especially in suburban jurisdictions. This did three things. It made neighborhoods quieter, it made them more exclusive, and it made them visually consistent. Once zoning required minimum lot sizes, setbacks, and use restrictions, diversity became illegal by default. You could not build a corner store. You could not add a duplex. You could not experiment. Sameness was no longer a choice. It was enforced. Post-war America and the explosion of suburbia. After World War II, America faced a housing crisis. Millions of returning soldiers, a booming population, an urgent demand for affordable homes. Developers like William Levitt responded with industrial logic. Levittown was not designed like a traditional town, it was designed like a factory. Each house followed the same basic plan, materials were standardized, construction crews repeated single tasks over and over. This was not about architecture. It was about speed. Levittown produced homes faster and cheaper than anything before it, and Americans embraced it.
The suburban dream was now accessible to the middle class. But there was a trade-off. The more efficient the system became, the less variation it allowed. Why sameness was a feature, not a flaw. From a developer's perspective, identical suburbs made perfect sense. They simplified approvals, they reduced design costs, they reassured lenders, they stabilized resale values. From a cultural perspective, sameness was comforting. A familiar house meant a familiar life. A predictable neighborhood meant perceived safety. A standardized suburb meant social belonging. Difference, in contrast, was framed as risk. This mindset hardened over decades. By the 1960s, the American suburb was no longer an experiment, it was a formula. And once a formula becomes dominant, it begins to erase alternatives. The long shadow of early decisions. What's important to understand is this. American suburbs do not look the same because Americans lack creativity. They look the same because policy, finance, transportation, and ideology aligned around a single vision of what a good neighborhood should be. A vision that prioritized separation over connection, efficiency over expression, stability over adaptability. The result was not just visual sameness, but structural sameness, and that sameness would soon reshape not only suburbs, but the fate of American cities themselves.
How cars, highways, and the death of organic neighborhoods. If the suburb was invented by ideology, it was perfected by the automobile. Without cars, American suburbs would never have become visually identical at a national scale. The car did not simply change how Americans moved, it changed how neighborhoods were imagined, designed, regulated, and valued. To understand why suburbs look the same, you must understand how deeply cities were redesigned around a machine. Before cars, neighborhoods were human-scaled. Before widespread car ownership, American neighborhoods followed a simple logic. People walked. Homes clustered near streetcar stops. Daily needs were reachable within minutes. Streets were narrow because speed was unnecessary. Most importantly, neighborhoods evolved slowly. A shop appeared where people gathered. A second-floor apartment was added when demand grew. A home became a duplex when a family needed income. This kind of neighborhood did not require architectural uniformity. It required adaptability. And adaptability created visual diversity. The automobile breaks the old logic. The automobile introduced speed, distance, and separation. Suddenly, where you lived no longer had to be near where you worked. The street stopped being a social space and became a traffic corridor. Distance stopped being a constraint and became a selling point. Developers no longer needed walkability. They needed access to roads. This shifted suburban design in a profound way. Neighborhoods were no longer built around people. They were built around vehicle movement. Roads as the new skeleton of suburbia. Once cars became central, roads stopped following terrain and human movement. They followed engineering standards. Curves were designed for speed control. Intersections were minimized. Cul-de-sacs became popular because they reduced through traffic. From an engineering perspective, this was logical. From an urban perspective, it was destructive. Cul-de-sacs isolated homes from one another. Collector roads concentrated traffic. Arteries cut neighborhoods into disconnected pods. The result was a landscape that looked organized from above, but felt fragmented on the ground. And because road standards were standardized nationally, the neighborhoods built around them began to look the same everywhere. Zoning and the death of organic life. Cars made separation practical. Zoning made it mandatory. Once families could drive everywhere, planners argued there was no need to mix uses. Homes went here, shops went there, offices went somewhere else entirely. This eliminated organic growth. In older neighborhoods, variety emerged naturally because people lived close together. In car-dependent suburbs, variety was forbidden. Every residential zone became functionally identical. Single-family homes,
driveways, front lawns, garages facing the street. Repeat. The garage becomes the dominant feature. One of the clearest visual signatures of suburban sameness is the garage. In older homes, garages were hidden or detached. In post-war suburbs, the garage moved forward. Why? Because the car became the primary interface between the home and the world. You no longer entered your neighborhood on foot. You arrived in a vehicle. Developers responded accordingly. The garage grew larger. The driveway became longer. The front door became secondary. This single change transformed the visual rhythm of American streets. Homes were no longer defined by porches or windows. They were defined by garage doors. And because garages follow standardized dimensions, the houses around them followed standardized proportions. Federal highways and suburban expansion. The Federal Aid Highway Act accelerated everything. Highways cut through cities, often destroying dense, diverse neighborhoods. Suburbs expanded outward, following interchanges and access ramps. Land near highways was cheap. Developers bought it in bulk. And bulk development demands repetition. Highways rewarded scale. Scale rewarded sameness. Small builders disappeared. Large firms dominated. Design diversity became inefficient. Parking requirements lock in uniformity. One of the most overlooked drivers of suburban sameness is parking policy. Local governments required minimum parking spaces for nearly every use. Homes required driveways and garages. Shops required vast parking lots. Apartments required multiple spaces per unit. Parking consumes space. Space costs money. To manage costs, developers simplified everything else. Rectangular lots, repeating layouts, predictable footprints. Once parking was mandatory, creative site design became financially risky. Sameness became safer. Streets lose their civic role. In traditional neighborhoods, streets were places. Children played there. Neighbors talked. Businesses thrived. In car-centered suburbs, streets became infrastructure.
They were designed to move vehicles efficiently, not to support social life. Wider roads meant higher speeds. Higher speeds discouraged walking. Less walking reduced spontaneous interaction. This feedback loop changed how Americans related to their surroundings. The street was no longer part of the neighborhood's identity. It was just something you passed through. Safety, fear, and visual predictability. Cars also reshaped how Americans thought about safety. Traffic accidents increased. Streets became dangerous for children. Parents responded by retreating indoors. Developers marketed suburbs as safe precisely because they were controlled. Limited entry points, predictable layouts, uniform housing. Visual sameness reinforced the perception of order. Order felt safe. Anything unfamiliar felt suspicious. This psychology further discouraged architectural experimentation. Why every suburb feels interchangeable. Once cars dominated daily life, suburban neighborhoods stopped responding to local context. Climate mattered less because people drove. Topography mattered less because roads were engineered. Culture mattered less because design templates traveled easily. A subdivision in Arizona followed the same logic as one in Ohio. Different materials, same form. Different weather, same layout. The suburb became portable, and portability demands sameness. The cost of automotive convenience. The car delivered freedom, but it demanded conformity. It freed Americans from distance. It freed developers from local constraints, but it also erased regional identity. Neighborhoods stopped reflecting place. They began reflecting standards. What looked efficient in spreadsheets became monotonous in reality, and over time, this monotony reshaped expectations. People stopped asking why suburbs looked the same. They assumed that's how they were supposed to look. A system that reinforces itself. One suburban form aligned with car infrastructure, zoning, and finance, it became self-reinforcing. Roads required cars required parking required space required low density required repetition. Breaking this cycle became nearly impossible. Any deviation was labeled risky, any alternative was labeled inefficient. The system rewarded conformity. The unintended legacy. The automobile did not destroy neighborhood diversity on purpose. It simply made uniformity easier. But ease is powerful. Once a system becomes easy to replicate, it spreads faster than more thoughtful alternatives. By the late 20th century, American suburbs were no longer designed. They were assembled. And when places are assembled instead of shaped, they begin to look identical. In the next part, we'll examine how finance, mortgages, and risk models turn suburban sameness into an economic necessity.
Mortgages, risk, and how finance standardized the American home. If cars determined the physical layout of suburbs, finance determined their appearance. American suburbs do not look the same because of taste alone. They look the same because banks, insurers, and federal policy decided what a safe home looked like. And once safety became measurable, difference became dangerous. Housing as a financial instrument. Before the 20th century, homes were personal assets. People built gradually. Additions happened over time. Houses reflected individual needs. But mass suburbanization required something different. It required predictability. For banks to lend money at scale, they needed to estimate risk quickly and consistently. That meant turning homes into standardized financial products. A unique house was difficult to evaluate. A familiar one was easy. The birth of the modern mortgage system. The modern American mortgage system was born during the Great Depression. Before the 1930s, most mortgages were short-term and risky.
Large down payments were required. Foreclosure was common. Federal intervention stabilized the system. The government insured long-term mortgages, making homeownership accessible to millions. But insurance came with rules. Homes had to meet certain standards to qualify. Neighborhoods had to meet certain patterns. Uniformity was not an aesthetic preference. It was a requirement for risk reduction. Appraisals reward sameness. One of the most powerful tools in shaping suburban design was the appraisal. Appraisers were trained to compare properties. Comparison requires similarity. If homes were alike, valuation was easy. If homes were different, uncertainty increased. Difference increased perceived risk. As a result, neighborhoods with consistent housing types were valued more highly. Design variety reduced appraisal confidence. Reduced confidence raised borrowing costs. Over time, this punished experimentation. The myth of the stable neighborhood. Financial institutions promoted the idea of neighborhood stability. Stability meant slow change. Slow change meant sameness. Any deviation was framed as potential decline. Mixed-use development? Risky. Multifamily housing? Risky. Architectural diversity? Risky. This thinking shaped not just suburbs, but local politics. Homeowners learned that protecting property value meant protecting uniformity. Why builders avoid variety? Large-scale developers respond to financial incentives. When lenders prefer predictability, builders deliver predictability. Reusing plans reduce design costs. Bulk purchasing reduced material costs. Repeat construction reduced labor uncertainty. But finance amplified these efficiencies. A standardized subdivision was easier to finance. Easier financing meant faster approvals. Faster approvals meant quicker profits. The system rewarded repetition. Insurance and the fear of difference. Insurance companies reinforced this logic. Homes built outside familiar patterns were harder to insure. Unusual materials raised premiums. Experimental designs increased scrutiny. The safest bet was conformity. This discouraged architectural innovation at the neighborhood scale. Innovation became isolated to custom homes, not communities. Secondary markets and national templates. As mortgages were bundled and sold nationally, local context mattered even less. A home in Florida became part of the same financial product as a home in Oregon. This required standardized assumptions. Climate differences were minimized. Cultural differences were ignored. The home became an abstract unit, and abstract units must be comparable. Risk models shape design. Risk models favor what can be measured: square footage, lot size, number of bedrooms, garage spaces. Qualities like beauty, adaptability, or social cohesion were invisible to spreadsheets. As a result, they were undervalued. Design focused on what could be quantified. This pushed suburban homes towards similar dimensions and layouts. The feedback loop of value. Once a neighborhood conformed to financial expectations, its value increased. Higher value attracted similar development nearby. Nearby similarity reinforced appraisal benchmarks. Breaking from the pattern became increasingly expensive. Alternative design struggled to secure financing. Struggling projects discouraged future attempts. Uniformity became self-perpetuating. Homeowners become enforcers. Financial logic eventually shaped homeowner behavior. People learned that resale value depended on conformity. This led to restrictive covenants and homeowner associations. Paint colors, roof materials, fence styles. Difference was regulated out of existence, not by planners, but by neighbors protecting their investment. The cultural shift. Over time, Americans internalized these financial rules as taste. What banks rewarded became what people wanted. A normal house became the ideal.
A weird house became undesirable. Sameness felt safe. Difference felt risky. This cultural shift was subtle but powerful. The cost of financial efficiency. The mortgage system succeeded in one undeniable way. It created the largest home-owning middle class in history, but it did so by narrowing the definition of acceptable housing. Design diversity was sacrificed for financial stability. Neighborhoods became interchangeable because interchangeability reduced risk. The invisible hand that shapes the street. When you drive through an American suburb, you are not just seeing architecture. You are seeing underwriting guidelines. You are seeing appraisal manuals. You are seeing insurance tables. The repetition is not accidental. It is the physical manifestation of financial logic.
Culture, identity, and why sameness feels comfortable in America. By the time American suburbs reached their peak expansion, their sameness no longer needed explanation. It felt natural. This was not because Americans lacked imagination, but because suburban uniformity had quietly become a cultural language, a language that communicated safety, success, and belonging without words. The suburb as a social signal. In America, housing has always been more than shelter. It is a signal. Where you live communicates who you are, how successful you are, and what kind of life you lead. The post-war suburb perfected this signaling. A detached house with a lawn did not just mean comfort. It meant stability. It meant responsibility. It meant having made the right choices. Sameness amplified that signal. When everyone around you lived in a similar home, your belonging was unquestioned. Difference introduced ambiguity. familiarity as comfort. Psychologically, humans trust what they can predict. Suburban design leaned heavily into this instinct. The same setbacks, the same roof lines, the same street widths. These repetitions reduced cognitive effort. You did not need to interpret your surroundings. You already understood them. This sense of familiarity created emotional safety, even when physical safety was unchanged. The fear of the unknown. American suburban culture grew alongside media narratives that framed cities as dangerous. Crime stories, urban decline imagery, political rhetoric. Suburbs were presented as controlled environments. Sameness became part of that control. A neighborhood that looked consistent felt managed. A neighborhood that looked different felt unpredictable. Difference was often misread as disorder. Homogeneity and social sorting. Suburbs were not only sorted by income, they were sorted by lifestyle, values, and expectations. Similar houses attract similar people. Similar people reinforce similar norms. Over time, this created feedback loops. People chose suburbs because they felt familiar. Familiarity produced sameness. Sameness reinforced identity. This was not accidental. Developers marketed lifestyles, not buildings. Architecture as cultural reassurance. Suburban homes were designed to reassure, not provoke. No sharp edges, no radical forms, no ambiguity. Architecture became background. This allowed residents to focus on private life rather than public space. The house was not meant to be questioned. It was meant to disappear into routine. Media and the suburban ideal. Television and film played a powerful role. Sitcoms normalized suburban settings. Advertisements framed them as aspirational. News reinforced them as safe. Repeated exposure shaped expectation. What appeared on screen became what felt normal. Normal became desirable. The role of childhood memory. For many Americans, suburbia is tied to childhood. Bike rides, backyards, quiet streets. These memories anchor emotional attachment. As adults, people often seek to recreate what felt safe. Sameness preserves memory. A familiar environment feels like continuity even when circumstances change. Community or conformity. Suburbs promised community, but the type of community they offered was passive. Neighbors shared space, not necessarily life. Uniformity reduced friction, but also reduced interaction. You were close, but not connected. This suited a culture that increasingly valued privacy. The unspoken agreement. Living in a suburb came with an unspoken contract. You agree not to stand out. Your neighbors agree not to challenge you. In return, everyone receives predictability. This contract is enforced socially. Unusual renovations are discouraged. Different uses are questioned. Change is resisted. Sameness becomes self-policing. Identity through exclusion. Sameness also works by defining what does not belong. Dense housing, commercial activity, noise, visual complexity. These elements are pushed elsewhere. The suburb defines itself by absence, and absence requires control. When taste becomes ideology. Over time, suburban preference stopped being about personal taste. It became ideological. The right kind of neighborhood, the proper way to live. Alternative models were dismissed as impractical or unsafe, not because they failed, but because they challenged the dominant narrative. The emotional cost. While sameness provides comfort, it also limits expression. Public life becomes thin. Shared spaces become rare. Individual identity retreats indoors. The suburb becomes a collection of private lives, not a collective culture. Why change feels threatening? When a system becomes tied to identity, change feels personal. Proposals for density feel like threats. Mixed use feels disruptive. Design variety feels destabilizing. This explains the intensity of suburban resistance to change. It is not about buildings. It is about belonging.
A culture that reinforces design. By the late 20th century, suburban sameness was fully cultural. Policy reinforced it. Finance rewarded it. Infrastructure enabled it. Culture normalized it. Breaking this pattern would require more than new designs. It would require a new story. What we haven't asked yet. For decades, Americans asked whether suburbs were comfortable. They rarely asked whether they were sustainable, or whether comfort came at a cost. In the next part, we'll examine how environmental limits and land economics began to expose the weaknesses of suburban sameness. If this perspective is useful, feel free to share it with someone who thinks about cities, housing, or how places actually work. And if you have thoughts on this, especially if you disagree, I'd love to read them in the comments.
Land, environment, and the hidden costs of repetition. For decades, suburban sameness was praised for its efficiency. But efficiency has a horizon. Beyond that horizon, costs appear. Not immediately, not dramatically, but persistently. By the late 20th century, the physical repetition of American suburbs began to reveal environmental and economic limits that had been quietly accumulating. Land as an infinite resource. Suburban expansion was built on an assumption. There would always be more land. In a country as large as the United States, this seemed reasonable. Developers spread outward. Zoning encouraged low density. Highways connected distant areas. But land is not just space. It is infrastructure, ecology, and long-term responsibility. Low density, high consumption. Suburban neighborhoods consume land at an extraordinary rate. Large lots, wide roads, setbacks, parking. Each home requires far more land than its urban equivalent. This creates hidden costs. Longer utility lines, more pavement to maintain, more distance for services to cover. The repetition of suburban form multiplies these costs across entire regions. Infrastructure that doesn't age well. Suburban infrastructure is expensive to build and expensive to maintain. Roads, water systems, sewer lines, electrical grids. When neighborhoods are built quickly, maintenance is deferred. The initial investment looks manageable. The long-term obligation is enormous. As suburbs age, local governments face budget gaps. The sameness that made construction efficient makes repair overwhelming. Environmental fragmentation. Suburban sprawl fragments ecosystems. Forests become patches. Wetlands are filled. Wildlife corridors disappear. Uniform development ignores natural boundaries. Road grids cut through landscapes that once absorbed water and moderated climate. Environmental systems do not scale like subdivisions. Water and storm management. Suburban repetition increases impermeable surfaces. Driveways, roofs, parking areas. Water that once soaked into soil now runs off quickly. This overwhelms storm systems and increases flooding. The cost is not visible in individual neighborhoods. It appears downstream. Energy dependence. Low-density suburbs lock in high energy use. Homes are larger. Distances are longer. Transportation is car-dependent. Even energy-efficient houses struggle against spatial efficiency. Repetition magnifies energy demand at the regional scale. The illusion of affordability. Suburban homes often appear affordable, but affordability is fragmented. Housing may be cheap. Transportation is not. Infrastructure taxes rise over time. Households absorb costs individually. Governments absorb costs collectively. The system looks affordable until it doesn't. The growth Pronzi problem. Many suburban municipalities rely on continuous expansion to fund existing obligations. New development pays for old infrastructure. When growth slows, the math fails. Maintenance costs remain. Revenue declines. Uniform suburbs age all at once. This creates synchronized financial stress. Loss of agricultural land. Suburban expansion often consumes high-quality farmland. Once developed, this land rarely returns to production. The repetition of suburban form accelerates this loss. Local food systems weaken. Regional resilience declines. Heat and microclimate. Suburbs intensify heat. Large roofs, wide asphalt surfaces, limited tree cover in newer developments. Uniform layouts amplify heat islands. This increases cooling demand and health risks. The cost of distance.
Distance is not neutral. Emergency services travel farther. School buses cover longer routes. Public services become inefficient. Repetition spreads these inefficiencies across metro areas. When efficiency becomes fragility, suburban design optimized for growth, not longevity. Standardized forms spread quickly, but they adapt poorly. When economic conditions change, neighborhoods struggle. Uniformity reduces resilience. The environmental reckoning. By the early 21st century, the environmental costs of suburban sameness became harder to ignore. Climate stress, infrastructure decay, budget constraints. The system that once promised freedom now demanded reform. Why change is so difficult? The environmental problems are systemic. They cannot be fixed by individual choices. They require structural change. But the very sameness that created the problem resists transformation. A turning point. Suburban repetition delivered stability for a time. But stability without adaptability becomes vulnerability. In the next part, we'll explore how design codes, HOAs, and regulation froze suburban form even as conditions changed.
HOAs, design codes, and the freezing of suburban form. By the time the costs of suburban sameness became visible, the ability to change had largely disappeared. Not because Americans lacked ideas, but because suburban form had been locked in by regulation. And much of that regulation did not come from the federal government. It came from within the suburbs themselves. The rise of private governance. As suburbs expanded, local governments struggled to manage new infrastructure. Developers offered a solution: homeowner associations. HOAs allowed municipalities to offload responsibility. Road maintenance, landscaping, and amenities became private. This lowered public costs, but it also shifted power. Rules as risk management. HOAs were framed as protectors of property value. Their authority came from one promise: prevent change. Change introduced uncertainty. Uncertainty threatened resale value. Rules multiplied. Exterior colors, roof materials, window styles, fence heights. What began as maintenance became design control. Codifying sameness. Design guidelines are often presented as aesthetic choices. In reality, they are economic tools. They ensure comparability. They simplify appraisal. They reassure buyers. But they also eliminate evolution. Once a neighborhood adopts a design code, deviation becomes costly or impossible. Architectural time capsules. Suburbs built in different decades are frozen snapshots. A 1970 suburb looks like the 1970s. A 1990 suburb looks like the 1990s. This is not nostalgia, it is regulatory inertia. Design rules prevent adaptation to new needs. Fear of the domino effect. HOAs operate on a belief in contagion. One change invites another. Another invites decline. This logic discourages even minor experimentation. A different roof color becomes a threat. A home office sign becomes controversial. Sameness is defended aggressively. Zoning as an ally. HOAs work alongside zoning laws. Zoning restricts use. HOAs restrict form. Together, they eliminate flexibility. Adding a rental unit becomes illegal. Converting a garage becomes forbidden. Even as household structures change, buildings cannot. The myth of neighborhood character. Design codes often claim to preserve character. But character is not static. Historic neighborhoods evolved over time. Suburbs are denied that evolution. What is preserved is not character, but consistency. Who benefits? Rules benefit existing owners. They protect investment. They limit competition. New residents adapt to old rules. This creates generational rigidity. Innovation moves elsewhere. Architectural innovation did not disappear. It moved. Custom homes. Urban infill. High-end developments. Mainstream suburbs became conservative by design. The cost of inflexibility. Rigid neighborhoods struggle with demographic change.
Aging populations need smaller units. Young families need affordability. Frozen form cannot respond. This leads to mismatch. Regulation without accountability. HOAs are private. They lack democratic transparency. They are difficult to reform. Residents enforce rules on one another. Social pressure replaces planning. When protection becomes constraint. What once protected value begins to constrain life. Rules accumulate. Context changes. Neighborhoods age without adapting. Why suburbs stay the same? Even when residents want change, the system resists. Finance discourages deviation. Zoning forbids it. HOAs enforce sameness. The result is architectural stasis. The hidden irony. Suburbs were born as an escape from rigid cities. They became rigid themselves. The lock-in effect. Once a suburb is built and regulated, change requires consensus. Consensus is rare. So the form persists. The future begins to knock. Despite these constraints, pressure is building. Housing shortages, climate adaptation, changing lifestyles. The frozen suburb is starting to crack. In the next part, we'll examine how housing shortages and demographic shifts are challenging suburban sameness.
Housing shortages, demographics, and the cracks in suburban sameness. For most of the 20th century, American suburbs worked because the math worked. Land was cheap, families were large, incomes were rising, households followed predictable patterns. That alignment is gone, and suburban sameness is no longer just a design issue, it is a constraint. The end of the one-size household. Suburbs were designed for a specific family model. 2 parents, multiple children, single income or dual income with stable careers. That model no longer dominates. Households are smaller. People marry later. More Americans live alone. More seniors age in place. But suburban housing has not changed. Large homes remain the default. Smaller options are rare. Flexibility is limited. The mismatch is structural. Housing shortages become visible. As urban populations grow and housing supply lags, pressure spreads outward. Suburbs absorb demand, but they are not designed to adapt quickly. Single-family zoning limits density. HOAs restrict conversions. Design codes block additions. Supply cannot respond. Prices rise. Sameness, once a stabilizer, becomes a bottleneck. Affordability and the suburban paradox. Suburbs were once the affordable alternative to cities. Now many are more expensive. Not because homes are luxurious, but because land is underused. Large lots house fewer people. Infrastructure costs rise. Scarcity increases value. Uniformity restricts options. Aging suburbs, aging residents. Many suburbs are aging simultaneously. Homes built in the same decade now require similar maintenance. Residents who moved in together are growing older together. But the built environment does not support aging. Stairs remain. Distances remain long. Services remain far away. Adaptation is difficult. The transportation burden. Car dependence becomes a liability as populations age. Driving declines. Isolation increases. Suburbs designed around mobility struggle with immobility. Sameness amplifies this problem. Alternative housing types are rare. Walkable centers are absent. Younger generations and different priorities. Younger Americans express different preferences. Walkability, flexibility, access over ownership. But suburban form offers limited choice. This creates generational tension. Communities resist change. Demand continues to grow. Informal adaptation begins. Where formal change is blocked, informal change appears. Garages become apartments. Homes are quietly subdivided. Rules are bent. These adaptations signal demand, but they also reveal dysfunction. Migration patterns shift. Some households move back to cities. Others move farther out. The middle hollow expands. Suburbs compete with each other, not cities. Sameness weakens their differentiation. The economic cost of inaction. When housing supply fails to adapt, economies suffer. Workers commute farther. Labor markets tighten. Inequality grows. Suburban rigidity becomes a regional problem. Pressure on local governments. Municipalities face pressure to allow change. Accessory units. Small-scale density. Mixed-use nodes. Resistance is strong. Change threatens identity. The cracks appear. The cracks are not dramatic. They are subtle. Vacant commercial strips. Aging infrastructure. Rising taxes. Sameness conceals fragility. The question shifts. The question is no longer whether suburbs should change. It is whether they can, and if not, what replaces them. A system at a crossroads. Suburban sameness delivered decades of stability, but stability without adaptation becomes stagnation. The pressure is mounting. In the next part, we'll explore what alternatives are emerging and how planners, designers, and cities are responding.
New urbanism, gentle density, and attempts to break the mold. When suburban sameness began to fail, the response was not revolution. It was adjustment. American planning culture rarely abandons systems outright. It modifies them cautiously. And that caution defines every attempt to break the suburban mold. The return of the walkable ideal. One of the earliest responses was new urbanism. Its premise was simple. If suburbs had lost something essential, perhaps it could be reintroduced. Walkable streets, mixed uses, human-scale blocks, visible public life. Designers looked backward to move forward. Planned nostalgia. New urbanist communities often resemble idealized towns. Porches return, garages retreat, shops reappear. But these places are not organic. They are curated. Everything is designed up front. Nothing is left to chance. Sameness remains, but in a different aesthetic. The limits of master planning. New urbanist developments improved street life, but they struggled with scale. They were expensive. They were limited in number. They often catered to higher-income residents. The broader suburban fabric remained unchanged. Gentle density as a compromise. More recently, planners turned to gentle density. Accessory dwelling units, duplexes and triplexes, small apartment buildings. These forms fit within existing neighborhoods. They challenge sameness quietly. Resistance to the small. Ironically, small changes face intense opposition. A single added unit feels more threatening than a distant large project. Change at the neighborhood scale is personal. Sameness feels fragile when challenged locally. Policy experiments. Some cities began removing single-family-only zoning. Others streamlined approvals for small-scale infill. The goal was flexibility, not transformation. But implementation varies. Local resistance slows progress. Design still constrained. Even where density is allowed, design codes persist. Height limits, parking minimums, aesthetic controls. The result is cautious evolution. Sameness softens but does not disappear. Market hesitation. Developers adapt slowly. Financing still favors familiar models. Risk remains tied to deviation. Innovation advances incrementally. Transportation and land use reconnect. Some suburbs invest in transit-oriented development. Density clusters near stations. Parking reduces. These nodes break monotony. But they remain islands. The cultural lag. Design can change faster than culture. Residents may accept new housing types, but still resist visual difference. Sameness lingers in expectation. What actually changes? Street networks rarely change. Lot patterns persist. Infrastructure remains fixed. Adaptation happens within constraints. Successes and trade-offs. Some communities gain vitality. Others struggle with partial implementation. Breaking sameness requires coordination. Design alone is insufficient. The slow unfreezing. Suburban form is not collapsing. It is thawing. Gradually. Unevenly. Change appears first where pressure is greatest. A transitional moment. The American suburb is no longer static. But it is not yet transformed. The system resists rapid change. The question of identity. As alternatives emerge, a deeper question arises. If suburbs no longer look the same, what do they become? In the next part, we'll examine whether sameness was a mistake or a phase, and what it reveals about American values.
Was suburban sameness a mistake or an American choice? It is tempting to describe suburban sameness as a failure, but that framing misses something important. American suburbs did not become uniform by accident. They became uniform because that uniformity delivered what Americans wanted at a specific moment in history. The question is not whether sameness was wrong. The question is what it was designed to do. Sameness as a solution. In the mid-20th century, the United States faced immense challenges. A housing shortage, a growing middle class, rapid population growth. Suburban repetition solved these problems efficiently. It delivered housing at scale, it stabilized property markets, it supported economic expansion. Sameness was functional. Predictability as freedom.
For many families, predictability meant freedom. Stable neighborhoods allowed long-term planning. Fixed costs supported household budgeting. Familiar environments reduced stress. Uniform suburbs created psychological safety. That mattered. The trade-offs were known. Planners and policymakers were not naive. They understood that low-density development used more land. They understood that car dependence created future obligations. But those costs were deferred. The benefits were immediate. Choice within constraint. Americans chose suburbs repeatedly, not because they were forced, but because alternatives were limited and stigmatized. Cities were framed as risky. Rural life lacked opportunity. The suburb appeared rational. Sameness as social agreement. Uniformity functioned as a social contract. You accept certain limitations. You gain stability in return. Most residents consider this fair. Who was excluded? However, choice was not equal. Access to suburbs was restricted by policy and finance. Uniformity often masked exclusion. This shaped who benefited from sameness. Adaptation versus permanence. Sameness worked when society was stable. It struggles in periods of rapid change. Demographics shift. Economies evolve. Technology alters daily life. Systems optimized for stability resist adaptation. Nostalgia distorts judgment. Looking backward, it is easy to criticize. But nostalgia obscures context. Suburban sameness was a response to its time. When solutions become constraints. The problem is not that suburbs look the same. The problem is that they can't easily look different. Flexibility was sacrificed for scale. Responsibility and agency. Understanding suburban sameness requires acknowledging agency. Americans supported policies that reinforced it. Communities defended it. Sameness reflects collective priorities. Reframing the question. The more useful question is not whether sameness was a mistake. It is whether it still serves its purpose. The role of memory. Suburbs are tied to personal memory. Critiquing them feels personal. This complicates reform. Learning without erasing. Change does not require erasing. It requires learning. The suburb can evolve without rejecting its history. A phase, not a verdict. Uniformity may represent a phase in American urban development. A phase shaped by specific economic and cultural conditions. What the suburb reveals. Suburban sameness reveals American values. Efficiency, stability, control, individualism. It also reveals American blind spots. Adaptability, public life, environmental limits. Standing at the edge of change. The system is under pressure, but it is not collapsing. It is waiting. In the final part, we'll examine what comes next, and whether American suburbs are capable of meaningful transformation.
What comes next? Can American suburbs change without losing themselves? American suburbs were never designed to change quickly. They were designed to last. That durability is both their strength and their weakness. As pressures mount, the question is no longer theoretical, it is practical. Can suburbs evolve without breaking the social contract that created them? The limits of incrementalism. Most suburban change today is incremental. An accessory unit here, a small mixed-use node there, a transit-oriented project near a station. These changes matter, but they do not alter the underlying structure. Road hierarchies remain, land use separation persists, car dependence continues. Incrementalism slows decline, but rarely reverses it. The infrastructure constraint. Suburbs are shaped by infrastructure decisions made decades ago: road widths, utility layouts, parcel sizes. These elements are expensive to modify. Transformation is not just political, it is physical. Density without disruption. One emerging strategy focuses on invisible change. More people, not more spectacle. Duplexes behind single-family facades, corner apartments that resemble large homes, internal subdivisions. Sameness remains visually intact while function changes quietly. This approach minimizes cultural resistance. Reclaiming the street. Some suburbs are reconsidering streets, narrowing lanes, adding sidewalks, planting trees. These changes reintroduce human scale. They do not change houses, but they change experience. Suburban centers, not sprawl. Rather than densifying everywhere, many planners focus on nodes, revitalized downtowns, transit hubs, redeveloped malls. These centers absorb growth. The surrounding fabric changes slowly. The mall as the new downtown. Dead malls represent opportunity. Large parcels, existing infrastructure, strategic locations. Redevelopment transforms sameness into complexity. Housing, offices, and public space converge. Cultural adaptation takes time. Physical change is easier than cultural change. Residents may accept new housing, but resist new identities. Transformation requires trust. Policy as a catalyst.
Zoning reform matters, removing single-family-only rules, reducing parking minimums, allowing mixed use. But policy alone is insufficient. Implementation determines outcomes. The risk of doing nothing. The greatest risk is stagnation. Aging infrastructure, rising costs, declining relevance. Suburbs that cannot adapt lose competitiveness. A new definition of stability. Stability no longer means sameness, it means adaptability, the ability to absorb change without collapse. What the future likely looks like. American suburbs will not disappear. They will fragment. Some will adapt and thrive. Others will struggle and decline. Sameness will erode unevenly. The end of the universal suburb. There will no longer be one suburban model. Regional differences will reemerge. Climate, culture, and economy will matter again. The suburb as a mirror. Suburbs reflect American priorities. When priorities shift, form follows. Slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. Final thought. American suburbs look the same because they were designed to solve a specific problem. That problem has changed. The future of suburbia depends on whether Americans are willing to let form evolve as values evolve. Not by rejecting the past, but by refusing to freeze it. American suburbs are often criticized for their sameness, but that sameness didn't come from nowhere. It came from choices, economic, cultural, and political, that made sense at the time. So here's the real question. If you grew up in a suburb, did it give you stability or did it limit your world? And if you live in one now, do you want it to stay exactly the same or quietly change to meet new realities? There's no single right answer, but the future of American cities will be shaped by how we answer that question together. Cities are shaped by more than buildings and roads. They're shaped by decisions that often feel ordinary while they're happening and only become visible years later. This channel looks at those hidden systems, how design, planning, and policy quietly influence everyday life. If this way of thinking is useful to you, subscribing helps support more long-form research-driven documentaries like this. And if you see your city differently, or if your experience challenges what was discussed here, I genuinely like to hear it in the comments. Good cities aren't built by agreement alone. They improve when better questions are asked.